Good morning, class. We are ready to start our very first milestone project. So I thought we'd go ahead and talk a little bit about what that process is. So at this point, you should have already accepted the classroom assignment, which gives you a starting repository specific to you. And we can go ahead and copy that URL to that repo and use that in Visual Studio to clone that repository. Or we can do this from the command line using git. So we'll go ahead and clone that. It'll take just a moment to pull down our code from GitHub. So if we go back to our Solution Explorer, you'll notice that we have two projects, data and data tests. And I've given you one enumeration that is our size enumeration. And I've also given you all the tests for the entrees and the enums that you're going to work on for this milestone. Now at this point, these tests are all commented out, and the reason for that is if we actually try using, for example, the class name that isn't defined yet, this will cause all kinds of errors. So let's actually go ahead and create one class as just kind of a walkthrough to help you with this process. So the first thing we're going to do is pick which class we're going to develop, and the one that I would like to tackle right now is this Livestock Mutilation, which is a platter of biscuits and gravy. So we are implementing a class to represent that named Livestock Mutilation, and Livestock Mutilation CS needs these properties: a name, which should be this, a description, which should have that value. It should return these calories and this price. In addition to those properties, it should have a Boolean property for gravy on the side, which indicates that we're not going to put the gravy directly on the biscuits, and it's false by default, so normally we would have them right on top. And if that is the case, if they've said they want the gravy on the side, that is a special instruction. It should appear in the special instructions list. So let's go ahead and create this class. And if we read the whole instructions, which you should have read the entire thing through, you'll notice that for the entree classes, all entrees should reside in the flying saucer data entrees namespace, and that means that we should have a folder for entrees in this data project, which we do not. So we'll go ahead and create that, and we'll add that folder, entrees. Now, with Visual Studio, the convention is each folder corresponds to a namespace, and the main project has a namespace. If we look at its properties, this is the flying saucer.data is our default namespace there, and then this would make everything in entrees be the flying saucer.data.entrees namespace. Now, you don't have to follow that convention, but that is what people would normally expect from us as programmers, so it's a good idea to actually follow that. And we'll go ahead and add a new item, which we're going to put in our class, and our class needs to be named, and it's important to get that name spelled and capitalized exactly the same as it is in the assignment description, and it's a Livestock Mutilation. You can see there I had an L where I shouldn't have had one. Mutilation. There we go. So we're going to add that, and we want this to be a public class. We want to add a comment at the top indicating what the file is and its purpose. And also we need an author. So in this case, and in your case, you would use your own name. Now if you go in and edit one that I've written or somebody else has written, you can add an editor line and say who it was that did the editing, that kind of thing. We also want to do XML style comments for everything. So in this case, we'll say Just a little summary, and now we're ready to start adding those required properties. So if we look at our properties that we're supposed to have in there, it should have a name, which is going to be a string. And remember, properties, we're going to write accessors, so getters and potentially setters. Now, name is going to be read-only, so there's no need to write a setter. We just want to provide the getter. And because we're just returning a value, we can just go ahead and do a return and give it the string. And that name is Livestock Mutilation. And again, make sure you spell it exactly as it is written in the requirements. And we need to, again, comment above every public property. And the next property, we have the description, which is a hearty gravy saturated with sausage poured over fluffy golden buttermilk biscuits. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for that. Public string description. And then we also want to make sure that we comment this. And we're on to our next property, which is the calories, which should be an unsigned integer. And that's 332 calories. And the next one is the price. And this should be a decimal. And the reason we use a decimal is a decimal has a fixed decimal point, which means it is not subject to floating point error, like a float or double would be. So when we're working with currency in C#, decimal is really the preferred data type to use. And we'll return $6.10. And notice that right here it's complaining. It's saying this is a double. You're saying this should be a decimal. And there's not an inherent cast between those because there is a very real chance that we will lose precision when we cast this to be a decimal. So there's two things we could do here. We could actually cast this explicitly. So say that, yes, I know this is a decimal, I want it to be treated as a decimal, and change this double into a decimal. Or, because we're declaring it as a literal, we can use one of the literal markers. So an M, which is kind of short for money, indicates that the number preceding it is actually meant to be a decimal. So this is now treated as a decimal. With undersigned integers, a U says that this is not a regular integer but an unsigned integer. Then also with floating point numbers, an F indicates a floating point number. And we have to use those for these types of values because basically there's nothing to visually say this is a unsigned integer versus an integer. So in order to kind of prompt the compiler to say, no, this is meant to be an unsigned integer, we use a U. Now there's not an equivalent for the integer because the integer is the default. Same here, when we just had a decimal point in the number, it defaulted to being a double. So we have to do an M for a decimal or an F for a float. And we want this to be a decimal, so we'll use the M. And then we said we had an additional Boolean property for gravy on the side. And because this one is something that we want to be able to change, we will want to make this be have both a getter and a setter. And what those are going to look like, there are a couple different ways we can declare these, but one of the things we want to do is be able to save that value and return that value. So we normally have a private backing variable, that, and I usually by convention use the same name as the property, but lowercase. Start with lowercase instead of uppercase. You may have seen, and some people prefer doing the underscore in front of that to indicate that this is a private variable. That's also perfectly acceptable. And then we're just going to return gravy on the side. And then when we do our set, we will say gravy on the side equals value, and value is the parameter that's being passed in to the setter. So this allows us to really treat this as a field where we're actually still using accessor methods. And then because we want a default value, we're going to go ahead and set this to be false as the default value. And that's really all the more we need to do there. Now, you'll notice it is giving us a suggestion, and they're saying we could use an auto property here. If you're not familiar with that syntax, it's basically syntactic sugar for doing this, where it's going to basically be a faster way of writing that we want a getter and a setter, and we want the default value to be false, and this is what it would look like. And that is also acceptable. What this does is it still creates that private backing field like we had before, but now that's being done by the compiler. So it just automatically says, oh, we need to store that value somewhere. I'm going to partition the space for that, make it available, set it to false as the default, and define a getter and setter that look exactly like the ones that we just had typed up. Now the downside to this is we can't access that field directly. We can only access it through the getter. So if there's some reason you need to access that within this class, you will want to use the private backing field that's explicitly spelled out. But either one is perfectly fine. I know that the Visual Studio tries to push you towards the auto property syntax, and that's because Visual Studio is built for production use, and they want you to write code as quickly as possible, and obviously this is a lot less typing. So if you want to use this format, that's fine. If you're not comfortable with that, you can use the regular full-blown defining the getter and setter where it's not an auto property. And either one is perfectly fine. Now we do need to have our comment on the top of this. Gets gravy should be served on the side. And finally, we have our special instructions, which should include the string gravy on the side if we're supposed to serve that gravy on the side. So for this one, we need to return a list of type string. And we're going to give back those special instructions. And again, this one should be read-only because we're not going to allow people to set what the special instructions are. Those are going to be defined by these types of Boolean flag variables. So we'll do a list string instructions equals new list of string, and then after we're done populating that list, we will return instructions. So that right there would just in turn return instructions as an empty list, and we need to put this in a getter. But we want something in that list if this gravy on the side is true. So we can very simply just test if gravy on the side is true. And because it's a Boolean, we can just put the field or the property directly in this if test. So if this evaluates to true, we're going to do whatever the true branch is. And in this case, that would be instructions.add, and we want to add that gravy on the side. And we want to double check that we spelled everything exactly like it is here. Gravy on the side, lowercase o, lowercase t, uppercase everything else. Throw our semicolon there. And of course, because they're only doing one instruction, if this if statement is true, we don't have to wrap this in the curly braces. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, you can always add the curly braces and just be very explicit, but it's a little faster to write it as a single line if you prefer. And of course, we have to add our summary, gets the special instructions for this entree. And if we go back to our description, it looks like we've covered everything. So we can go ahead and save this. And now we also have unit tests for this livestock mutilation. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. And notice these are commented out. If I uncomment these, and it looks like everything's showing up fine there. It's not complaining. We don't see any red underlines. So it is finding our livestock mutilation class now that we've defined it. If it's not finding it, some of the things that might be a problem, this class might actually be not public. By default, it doesn't throw the public on there, so you need to make sure that that's there, or this other project can't see it. We also need to make sure that this data project is being set up as a dependency here. We expand this, notice down in projects we have the flying saucer.data, so that we're actually compiling this project into a DLL that then our test is looking at here. If that's not set, we can go ahead and come right click on data tests and, dependencies in the data test and add project reference. Just make sure this checkbox is checked next to the data project to say this test project uses that project. And that all looks good. We can go ahead and run our tests. So if we go up to test, run all tests, that will open our test window. And notice that it looks like our entrees now has 7 tests for livestock mutilation. Description should be correct, name should be correct, should be able to set potatoes, calories, price, and provide current special instructions. These are all passing, so we've probably got it done right. And then of course we had the size tests that were there before. So it looks like we're in pretty good shape. So that wraps up right in our first class for the livestock mutilation. Now obviously you're going to have to go ahead and write the rest of the 6 classes that are required, uncomment the rest of those tests and run and make sure that you've got everything written the way you want. Once you've done all that, you want to push this back to GitHub, and then on your GitHub repository you're going to create a release. And then you're going to give us the release URL to turn in the milestone when you're all done. Very quickly to kind of look at what that looks like. Once you've pushed your code back up here, and you need to make sure that you've got it all, so not just what code was already there, but anything you've added needs to also be pushed. Once you've done that, if you go to, where is our releases? Tags branch. Oh, there on the side. So no release is published yet. We'll go ahead and create a new release, and we're going to give it a tag. So in this case, we're using semantic versioning. So V followed by 3 numbers separated by periods, which are the major, minor, and patch numbers. So this is our very first project, and it's kind of in pre-release form. So we're going to start with V0 for the major release, and for all of our first set of milestones which deal with this data project, they're all going to be version 0 is the major version number. And then this is the first milestone, so we're going to do 1 is the next number. And then we don't have any patches on this. This is our first release for this specific milestone. So that's what we go ahead and name that. And then we can go ahead and call this data library milestone 1 release or something like that. And you can also add a description, and then potentially you can check this. I mean, technically it's a pre-release, so we might. That just tells people that this code is not ready for prime time. Then we go ahead and click this publish release. That's going to create the release. It's going to take us to the page showing us the release information. And the link, the URL to that is what you're going to copy from up here and paste into your Canvas assignment to actually give us that assignment back. If you submit your assignment and then realize you forgot something, you didn't commit a file, or you made a mistake and you want to change it and update it, that's fine. Just come back in here, do another release, change the patch number to be 1 larger. So in this case, it would be patch 1. And you just kind of keep doing that until you're happy and you've got everything you need there. It's a good idea to actually clone your repo again after you've gotten everything committed. Make sure you can run it, make sure there's no missing files. That will help you out. If you turn it in and there's missing files, we are not going to be very generous in the grading. We're going to tell you to resubmit, and it's going to be a late submission, and you're going to take the late penalty. Because at this point, you guys have worked with GitHub enough, you've worked with programming enough that you should know how to make sure all your files are there, and that's just part of being very cognizant of what you're doing. If you're in the working world and you forget to commit files, you're going to have a lot of people very upset with you. So you really need to get in the habit of double checking your work, making sure that everything is committed and pushed and released exactly as it should be. And that wraps up our discussion for this morning. So thanks for joining me. Stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.